The Anarchy, The Rise and Fall of the East India Company by William Dalrymple is a vivid chronicle of how a modest English trading corporation transformed into a powerful empire builder. The book begins by framing the contrasting worlds of the Mughal Empire, a realm of immense wealth and sophistication, and the East India Company, a small group of Elizabethan merchants seeking fortune. Founded in 1599, the company's early years were marked by bold ambitions, maritime adventures, and precarious beginnings as it sought to challenge Portuguese and Dutch dominance in Eastern trade. Dalrymple describes the company's initial dependence on Indian rulers for trade access, which shifted dramatically as the Mughal Empire fragmented. Exploiting this instability, the company transitioned from merchant to political power. The pivotal Battle of Plassey in 1757, orchestrated by Robert Clive, marked the conquest of Bengal, bringing immense wealth and control over India's richest province. The company's practices, however, were brutal, driven solely by profit, with policies like extortionate taxation contributing to catastrophic events such as the Bengal famine, which killed millions. The narrative highlights the paradox of a private corporation operating as a sovereign power, with its armies, fortresses, and foreign policies. Figures like Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, reflect the moral and political complexities of this system, as his impeachment trial exposed both his administrative brilliance and the company's excesses. Dalrymple traces the company's expansion through the destruction of Indian states such as Mysore and the Maratha Confederacy, culminating in its capture of Delhi in 1803. The Mughal emperor was reduced to a puppet, symbolizing the complete subjugation of India by this corporate empire. Dalrymple concludes by reflecting on the company's legacy, framing it as a cautionary tale of unregulated corporate power. The story of the East India Company is not just about historical conquest but also about the dangers of profit-driven imperialism and its devastating human cost. Through rich storytelling and incisive analysis, The Anarchy offers a profound exploration of one of history's most extraordinary and troubling episodes. The opening chapter of The Anarchy, titled 1599, sets the stage for the formation of the East India Company, providing a vivid portrait of the era and the ambitions that fueled its creation. Dalrymple begins by evoking a bustling scene in late Elizabethan London, where a diverse group of merchants, adventurers, and civic leaders gather at Founders Hall to petition Queen Elizabeth I for a charter to trade with the East Indies. At the time, England was a relatively minor player on the global stage, poor, isolated, and overshadowed by the wealth and naval power of Spain and Portugal. Yet, the country was driven by desperation and ingenuity, seeking new avenues for trade and wealth in the face of economic challenges and political isolation. The chapter captures the boldness and uncertainty of this venture. The merchants had little experience with long-distance trade compared to their rivals and faced immense risks. The Dutch, for example, had just returned from a highly profitable spice voyage, making the English painfully aware of the riches at stake and the competition ahead. Dalrymple delves into the motivations of the merchants, who were united by their desire to break free from reliance on Middle Eastern middlemen and to establish direct access to the lucrative markets of Asia. Dalrymple introduces some of the colorful figures behind this enterprise. Among them are Sir Thomas Smythe, a prominent merchant who spearheaded the initiative, and a mix of seafarers, former privateers, and aspiring adventurers who embodied the restless energy of the age. He also provides a glimpse of the challenges they faced, from the technical difficulties of long voyages to the diplomatic hurdles posed by Spain's and Portugal's existing claims in the East Indies. In this chapter, Dalrymple skillfully conveys the audacity of the company's founders. While they could not foresee the vast empire their creation would eventually build, they believed in the possibilities of profit and expansion. The Queen's eventual granting of the charter on the last day of 1600 marked the birth of an entity that would transform global history. This foundational chapter establishes the East India Company as a product of its time, driven by ambition, ingenuity, and a willingness to take immense risks in pursuit of wealth and power. Chapter 2 of The Anarchy, titled An Offer He Could Not Refuse, delves into the early expansion of the East India Company, focusing on its gradual evolution from a trading enterprise to a political and military power in India. The chapter portrays the company's efforts to establish a foothold in a land already brimming with wealth and power, dominated by the Mughal Empire, which at the time was still a global superpower. Dalrymple weaves together the story of how the company navigated the delicate balance between diplomacy and aggression, using guile, negotiation, and calculated force to embed itself in the fabric of Indian commerce and governance. Dalrymple introduces the reader to Robert Clive, one of the company's most pivotal figures. Clive, an ambitious and audacious young man, arrived in India initially as a clerk, but quickly realized that the opportunities for wealth and power lay beyond the confines of trade. His rise mirrored the company's growing realization that influence over local politics could serve its financial interests far more effectively than mere commerce. Dalrymple vividly recounts how Clive's military genius and ruthless pragmatism were instrumental in the company's shift from being merchants to becoming de facto rulers. Central to this chapter is the company's involvement in the intricate web of Indian politics. The death of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb had left the empire fractured, with provincial governors and local rulers vying for power. The company exploited these divisions, aligning itself with some rulers while undermining others. Dalrymple describes how Clive maneuvered to secure alliances and establish the company as a force to be reckoned with, particularly in Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions of the subcontinent. Through a mix of military might and political cunning, the company began to assert itself as a decisive player in the region. The chapter culminates with the company's growing audacity, as it used its private armies to influence local governance and impose its will. Dalrymple highlights the moral ambiguities and contradictions inherent in this process. On one hand, the company claimed to represent British trade interests, but in reality, it was becoming a colonial power, driven by the singular goal of enriching its shareholders. The foundations of corporate imperialism were being laid, with Clive at its helm, orchestrating events that would irrevocably change the course of Indian history. Dalrymple's narrative in this chapter is both riveting and unsettling. He shows how the company's strategies, ruthless in their focus on profit, set the stage for its transformation into a political juggernaut. Through Clive's story and the company's early machinations in India, Dalrymple reveals the complex interplay of ambition, greed, and power that propelled this unprecedented corporate entity toward dominance. This chapter serves as a turning point in the book, illustrating the company's first major steps toward becoming a ruling force in India. Chapter 3 of the Anarchy, titled Sweeping with the Broom of Plunder, delves into the East India Company's transformation from a trading corporation to a full-fledged colonial power, employing systemic exploitation and ruthless military aggression. In this chapter, William Dalrymple vividly recounts how the company, under the leadership of Robert Clive and his successors, consolidated its hold over Bengal, one of the richest regions of the Mughal Empire, and began to extract unprecedented wealth from its lands and people. Dalrymple describes the fallout from the company's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, a turning point that gave the company political control over Bengal. What began as an act of corporate greed escalated into a full-scale plundering of the province. Clive, having installed Mir Jafar as the puppet Nawab of Bengal, orchestrated a scheme where the company effectively drained Bengal's resources through extortionate taxation, forced trade monopolies, and outright looting. Dalrymple highlights the moral and economic catastrophe of these policies, as Bengal's wealth, once the backbone of the Mughal Empire, was funneled into the company's coffers in London, leaving local economies in ruin. Dalrymple details the devastating consequences of this exploitation, particularly the Bengal famine of 1769–70, which wiped out millions of lives. The famine, he explains, was exacerbated by the company's relentless focus on profit. Rather than alleviate the suffering, the company continued to extract taxes and enforce harsh trade policies, showing no regard for the welfare of the population. This stark example of corporate indifference underscores the destructive power of unregulated capitalism, a central theme of Dalrymple's book. The chapter also explores the inner workings of the company during this period. Dalrymple paints a picture of an organization driven by greed, corruption, and self-interest. Senior officials, many of whom had amassed vast fortunes through bribes and extortion, returned to Britain as nabobs, living opulent lifestyles that starkly contrasted with the misery they had left behind in Bengal. These actions sparked outrage in Britain and led to growing calls for oversight, But Dalrymple emphasizes how Parliament's vested interest in the company's profitability often muted criticism and enabled further abuses. At the heart of the chapter is the growing realization that the East India Company was no longer just a trading entity, it had become a colonial government in all but name. Dalrymple explores how this shift was facilitated by its private army, which had grown to rival that of many nation-states. The company's military campaigns, funded by the wealth extracted from Bengal, expanded its territorial control, further entrenching its dominance in India. This era of aggressive expansion was marked by increasing violence, with the company ruthlessly crushing resistance from local rulers and populations. Through detailed narratives and compelling character sketches, Dalrymple captures the complexity and brutality of this period. He contrasts the immense wealth flowing into Britain with the poverty and suffering endured by the people of Bengal, offering a searing critique of the company's operations. By the end of the chapter, the East India Company has firmly established itself as a corporate empire, its actions foreshadowing the even greater conquests and upheavals to come. Dalrymple's exploration of this chapter reveals not only the human cost of the company's rise, but also the moral and political questions that would haunt its legacy for centuries. Chapter 4 of the Anarchy, titled A Prince of Little Capacity, examines the next phase in the East India Company's domination of India, focusing on its entanglement with local rulers and its role in the continuing fragmentation of the Mughal Empire. William Dalrymple paints a vivid picture of a region in turmoil, where ambition, betrayal, and incompetence shaped the trajectory of empires. At the heart of the chapter is the story of Mir Jafar, the puppet Nawab of Bengal installed by Robert Clive after the Battle of Plassey, whose ineffectiveness and pliability epitomize the company's cynical manipulation of Indian rulers. Dalrymple portrays Mir Jafar as a man ill-suited for the role of ruler. Weak-willed and indecisive, he was utterly dependent on the company, which exploited his position to siphon off Bengal's wealth. The company's officers dictated his policies, controlled his treasury, and marginalized his authority, all while claiming to uphold his sovereignty. Mir Jafar's inability to govern effectively created chaos in Bengal, further destabilizing the region and deepening the suffering of its people. Dalrymple captures the irony of a ruler who held nominal power but was utterly subjugated by a foreign corporation. This chapter also delves into the broader implications of the company's strategy of indirect rule. By propping up weak leaders like Mir Jafar, the company avoided the risks and costs of direct administration while securing its control over Bengal's resources. Dalrymple details how this approach allowed the company to act with impunity, maintaining the facade of Mughal authority while systematically dismantling its foundations. The arrangement, however, was inherently unstable, as the company's constant interference alienated both the local population and the nobility, fueling resentment and resistance. Dalrymple also explores the consequences of this system for the company itself. The vast wealth flowing into its coffers created divisions within its ranks, as senior officials vied for influence and profit. Corruption and greed became endemic, with company officers enriching themselves at the expense of both their employer and the people they governed. These internal conflicts mirrored the external instability the company had created in Bengal, as its pursuit of profit undermined the very structures it sought to control. At the same time, Dalrymple reveals how the company's actions in Bengal had ripple effects across India. Other regional powers watched the events in Bengal with a mixture of fear and opportunism, as they sought to navigate the shifting balance of power. The Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, attempted to reassert his authority, but his efforts were undermined by the company's growing dominance and his own precarious position. The chapter vividly captures this period of political fragmentation, where alliances shifted constantly and the fate of empires hung in the balance. By the end of the chapter, it becomes clear that the company's exploitation of Bengal had set a dangerous precedent. Its ability to control local rulers and extract wealth with little accountability emboldened its ambitions, pushing it further into the realm of territorial conquest. Dalrymple's narrative reveals the human cost of these ambitions, as the company's pursuit of profit left a trail of suffering and destruction in its wake. The Prince of Little Capacity serves as a poignant reminder of how the intersection of greed and incompetence can have devastating consequences, both for those who wield power and for those who live under it. The chapter closes with the company firmly entrenched in Bengal, but with the seeds of further conflict and upheaval already sown. Chapter 5 of the Anarchy, titled Bloodshed and Confusion, takes the reader deeper into the chaos that engulfed India as the East India Company expanded its influence through calculated aggression and opportunism. William Dalrymple narrates a period marked by relentless conflict, where the political fragmentation of the Mughal Empire allowed the company to exploit divisions among Indian rulers. This chapter explores the human and political cost of these wars, painting a grim picture of the anarchy that followed the disintegration of centralized authority in India. Dalrymple focuses on the unraveling of Bengal, which had become a battleground for the company's ambitions and the resistance of local powers. The fragile system of indirect rule established under Mir Jafar crumbled as the company's demands grew ever more insatiable. The new Nawab, Mir Qasim, initially sought to cooperate with the company, but soon found himself at odds with its relentless pursuit of wealth and control. Dalrymple portrays Mir Qasim as a more capable and ambitious ruler than his predecessor, but one whose attempts to reform governance and reclaim authority provoked the wrath of his corporate overlords. His eventual rebellion against the company led to violent clashes, culminating in the devastating Battle of Buxar in 1764. The Battle of Buxar, which Dalrymple recounts in vivid detail, was a watershed moment. It not only marked a decisive victory for the East India Company but also cemented its dominance over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The company's private army, now one of the most formidable military forces in India, defeated an alliance of Mir Qasim, Shuja'ud-Daulah, the Nawab of Awadh, and the weakened Mughal Emperor, Shah Alam II. This victory demonstrated the company's capacity to outmaneuver and overpower even well-coordinated Indian resistance. Dalrymple underscores the tragic consequences of this conflict, as the defeat of these regional powers further eroded the possibility of an Indian counterbalance to the company's growing hegemony. At the same time, Dalrymple delves into the internal struggles of the company itself. Its rapid accumulation of wealth and power bred corruption, factionalism, and greed among its officials. Senior officers competed for spoils, often undermining one another in their quest for personal gain. The company's London directors, increasingly alarmed by the scale of corruption and the reckless behavior of their representatives in India, began to call for reforms, though their efforts were often too little, too late. Dalrymple's portrayal of this internal dysfunction highlights the inherent instability of a corporation attempting to function as a sovereign power. Dalrymple also widens the lens to examine the broader consequences of the company's actions. The instability it created in Bengal and beyond was emblematic of the larger disintegration of Mughal authority across India. As the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II sought refuge and struggled to maintain even a semblance of power, the traditional structures of governance collapsed, leaving vast swathes of the subcontinent in turmoil. Dalrymple vividly describes this period of bloodshed and confusion, where the ambitions of local rulers, the resistance of displaced communities, and the unrelenting expansion of the East India Company collided in a landscape of chaos. The chapter paints a harrowing picture of the anarchy that emerged as the company tightened its grip on India. It was a time of unchecked exploitation, where the pursuit of profit came at the expense of governance, stability, and human life. Dalrymple captures the profound sense of loss and disarray that pervaded the Indian heartland, as the old order gave way to a new and often brutal regime of corporate imperialism. By the end of the chapter, the East India Company stood as the dominant force in northern India, its power consolidated through bloodshed, its ambitions unchecked, and its influence spreading further into the fractured remains of the Mughal Empire. This period of violence and upheaval serves as a chilling reminder of the destructive consequences of greed and unchecked power. Chapter 6 of the Anarchy, titled Racked by Famine, examines one of the most devastating consequences of the East India Company's rule over Bengal, the Bengal famine of 1769–70. William Dalrymple vividly portrays the scale of human suffering caused by the famine, while illustrating how the company's policies of exploitation and indifference exacerbated the catastrophe. This chapter reveals the brutal realities of corporate governance when profit is prioritized over human lives, offering a grim look at the moral cost of the company's rise to power. Dalrymple sets the stage by describing Bengal as a land once celebrated for its immense wealth and fertility. Known as the paradise of nations, it was one of the richest regions in the world, a hub of trade, agriculture, and artisanal production. Yet, under the company's control, this prosperity was systematically drained. The company's primary focus was to extract maximum revenue from Bengal, which it did by imposing extortionate taxes and monopolizing key industries like textiles and agriculture. Dalrymple details how this relentless extraction created a fragile economic system, one that left the population vulnerable to even minor disruptions. The famine, Dalrymple explains, began with a failure of the monsoon, leading to widespread crop failures. As the rivers dried up and the fields withered, millions of farmers and laborers faced starvation. Yet, instead of offering relief, the East India Company continued to demand the full payment of taxes from those affected. Its officers, driven by greed and the need to meet revenue targets, ignored the growing crisis, even as reports of mass deaths began to pour in. Dalrymple underscores the callousness of the company's policies, showing how its insistence on extracting wealth during the famine worsened the suffering of millions. The chapter provides harrowing accounts of the human toll. Villages were depopulated, corpses littered the countryside, and entire families succumbed to hunger and disease. Dalrymple recounts how artisans, unable to pay their taxes or procure food, abandoned their looms and fled their towns. This exodus decimated Bengal's once thriving textile industry, creating economic devastation that would linger for decades. Despite the scale of the disaster, the company remained unmoved, more concerned with securing its profits than addressing the humanitarian crisis unfolding under its rule. Dalrymple also examines the moral and political fallout of the famine. In Britain, reports of the catastrophe sparked outrage and raised uncomfortable questions about the company's governance. Critics accused the company of prioritizing its shareholders' dividends over the welfare of its subjects, labeling its actions as nothing short of criminal. Yet, as Dalrymple notes, even this public outcry failed to bring meaningful reform. The British Parliament, many of whose members were shareholders in the company, hesitated to take significant action, fearing the economic consequences of disrupting such a profitable enterprise. The chapter captures the stark duality of the company's operations. While its revenues soared, funded by the suffering of millions, Bengal's economy and society were collapsing. Dalrymple portrays this as a turning point in the company's rule, a moment that exposed the fundamental flaws of its governance model. The famine was not just a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe, worsened by policies that prioritized profit over people. By the end of the chapter, the scale of the tragedy becomes clear. An estimated 10 million people, roughly one-third of Bengal's population, had perished. Yet the East India Company emerged richer and more powerful, having extracted vast sums from the province even during the height of the famine. Dalrymple leaves the reader with a profound sense of injustice, showing how the pursuit of profit by an unregulated corporation led to one of the worst humanitarian disasters in history. This chapter underscores the devastating human cost of the company's imperial ambitions, laying bare the moral vacuum at the heart of its rule. Chapter 7 of the Anarchy, titled The Desolation of Delhi, takes the narrative northward, focusing on the decline of the Mughal Empire and the symbolic and strategic conquest of its heart, Delhi, by the East India Company. William Dalrymple vividly portrays the chaos, violence, and cultural disintegration that accompanied the company's expansion into northern India. Through this chapter, he unravels the tragic story of Shah Alam II, the last significant Mughal emperor, whose reign became a poignant symbol of the empire's collapse and the company's ruthless rise. Dalrymple begins by painting a stark picture of Delhi in the late 18th century, a city once celebrated as the jewel of the Mughal Empire but now reduced to a shadow of its former glory. After decades of invasions, betrayals, and internal power struggles, the Mughal court had become little more than a ceremonial relic. The once mighty emperor, Shah Alam II, was a figure of profound tragedy. Blinded by a vengeful noble, betrayed by his allies, and dependent on shifting factions, Shah Alam embodied the ruin of an empire that had once ruled over much of the subcontinent. Into this vacuum stepped the East India Company, Dalrymple narrates the company's deliberate strategy to position itself as the dominant power in northern India. With its growing private army and mastery of political manipulation, the company entered into alliances with various Indian rulers, promising protection while steadily undermining their authority. Shah Alam, desperate for security amid the anarchy, sought refuge under the company's protection, a decision that symbolized the Mughal Empire's submission to this foreign corporation. Dalrymple recounts the dramatic events surrounding the company's entry into Delhi in 1803. The Mughal capital, already weakened by years of decline, fell with little resistance. Shah Alam was reduced to a puppet, his court preserved only as a facade of legitimacy for the company's rule. Dalrymple's vivid descriptions of the emperor's humiliation, sitting sightless in his broken palace while the company's representatives dictated terms, capture the profound cultural and political shift that was taking place. The once great Mughal Empire was now effectively a vassal of a private corporation headquartered in London. The chapter also delves into the cultural and social consequences of this conquest. Dalrymple explores how the company's rise disrupted the rich tapestry of Mughal life, including its patronage of art, architecture, and literature. The city of Delhi, once a beacon of culture and sophistication, descended into desolation as its wealth and institutions were drained. The symbolic significance of this loss is palpable. The fall of Delhi marked not just a military defeat, but also the end of an era in Indian history. Dalrymple emphasizes the irony of the situation. A small group of British merchants, who had once humbly sought trading privileges from Mughal emperors, now ruled over the empire's remnants. The company's conquest of Delhi was both a culmination of its ambitions and a harbinger of further domination. The chapter closes with a haunting image of Shah Alam, blind and powerless, presiding over a court that had become a mere shadow theater, while the real power resided in the hands of company officials. The desolation of Delhi is a deeply moving chapter, capturing the human cost of imperial decline and corporate conquest. Dalrymple's narrative underscores the relentless expansion of the East India Company and the devastating consequences for India's cultural and political heritage. The chapter encapsulates the transition from the Mughal world to the company's empire, revealing a landscape of loss, upheaval, and transformation that would define the subcontinent for decades to come. Chapter 8 of the Anarchy, titled The Impeachment of Warren Hastings, shifts the focus to one of the most dramatic and contentious moments in the East India Company's history. William Dalrymple explores the rise and fall of Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, whose trial in Britain became a flashpoint for debates about the morality of imperialism, corporate greed, and governance. Through Hastings's story, Dalrymple examines the contradictions and consequences of the company's growing dominance over India. Warren Hastings is portrayed as a complex and polarizing figure. On the one hand, he was a diligent administrator, an Indophile, and a man of scholarly disposition who sought to understand and preserve Indian traditions. On the other, he was deeply complicit in the company's most exploitative practices. Hastings governed during a period of extraordinary turmoil, as the company expanded its territory through wars and treaties, leaving devastation in its wake. Dalrymple presents Hastings as a man caught between his intellectual admiration for Indian culture and the brutal realities of managing a profit-driven empire. The impeachment trial, which began in 1788 and lasted 7 years, serves as the centerpiece of the chapter. Dalrymple describes how Hastings was accused of corruption, extortion, and abuse of power during his tenure in India. The charges ranged from his involvement in the forced resettlement of populations to his complicity in the financial exploitation of Bengal and other regions. The trial, spearheaded by the eloquent and fiery Edmund Burke, was as much a moral reckoning for the East India Company as it was a personal trial for Hastings. Burke's speeches lambasted the company's actions as crimes against humanity, painting a vivid picture of the suffering inflicted upon India by its corporate rulers. Dalrymple brings the courtroom drama to life, capturing the theatricality of the trial and the broader implications it held for the British Empire. While Hastings had his defenders, who argued that he acted pragmatically under difficult circumstances, the trial laid bare the contradictions of the company's rule. It claimed to bring order and civilization to India, yet its methods were marked by violence, corruption, and greed. Dalrymple uses the trial to underscore the moral ambiguity of Hastings's governance, which oscillated between enlightened reform and ruthless exploitation. The trial also exposed the tangled relationship between the East India Company and the British government. While the company operated independently, its actions were inseparable from Britain's imperial ambitions. Many members of Parliament were shareholders in the company, creating conflicts of interest that complicated efforts to reform its practices. Dalrymple highlights the hypocrisy and self-interest that pervaded these debates, as Britain sought to profit from the company's conquests while distancing itself from its excesses. Hastings himself emerges as a tragic figure. Despite his formidable intellect and administrative skill, he became a scapegoat for the company's broader failures. Dalrymple portrays him as a man who believed in the righteousness of his actions, but who was ultimately undone by the sheer weight of the atrocities committed under his governance. Though he was eventually acquitted, the trial left Hastings financially ruined and deeply disillusioned, a poignant end for a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in British India. Dalrymple uses this chapter to reflect on the broader implications of the impeachment. It was one of the first major public reckonings with the ethical dilemmas of imperialism, exposing the violence and greed that underpinned the company's rule. At the same time, the trial failed to bring about meaningful reform, as the company continued its expansion and exploitation in India. By the end of the chapter, Dalrymple leaves the reader with a sense of unresolved tension. Hastings's acquittal may have spared him, but it did little to address the systemic injustices of the company's empire. In The Impeachment of Warren Hastings, Dalrymple provides a gripping and deeply thought-provoking account of one of the most pivotal episodes in the East India Company's history. The chapter captures the moral ambiguities of its rule, the personal drama of Hastings's trial, and the broader questions of justice and accountability that still resonate today. It is a powerful exploration of the intersection between individual ambition, corporate greed, and imperial power. Chapter 9 of the Anarchy, titled The Corpse of India, brings the narrative to a grim culmination, exploring the devastating consequences of the East India Company's unchecked dominance over India. William Dalrymple frames this chapter as an unflinching examination of the systematic destruction wrought by the company, not just on India's economy, but on its social, political, and cultural fabric. By this stage, the company had consolidated its control over vast territories, yet its methods, driven by profit and exploitation, had left the subcontinent in ruins. Dalrymple begins with the aftermath of the company's conquests, particularly its relentless focus on extracting wealth from the territories it now controlled. By the early 19th century, the East India Company had become more than a trading corporation. It was a sprawling imperial power, controlling a private army larger than most nation-states and governing millions of people. However, the company's rule was defined not by governance or reform but by exploitation. Dalrymple vividly describes the economic devastation. Villages abandoned, agriculture disrupted, and local industries, especially textiles, obliterated by exploitative policies and competition from British imports. What had once been the world's richest economy, producing a quarter of global output, was reduced to poverty and stagnation. The chapter turns to the political consequences of the company's actions. Dalrymple illustrates how the collapse of traditional structures of power under the Mughal Empire was compounded by the company's approach to governance. The Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, by now a blinded and broken man, remained a tragic figurehead, his empire reduced to the walls of his Delhi palace. Across the subcontinent, the chaos and uncertainty of the so-called anarchy persisted, exacerbated by the company's policies of divide and rule and military suppression. Dalrymple portrays this as a period of profound dislocation, where Indian rulers who had once governed their lands with relative autonomy were either co-opted into submission or crushed under the weight of the company's ambitions. Dalrymple's narrative highlights the human cost of this imperial experiment. He describes the destruction of social cohesion as entire communities were uprooted or marginalized. The company's focus on profit came at the expense of the welfare of its subjects, who were reduced to little more than tools for generating revenue. Even as famine and economic collapse claimed millions of lives, the company's shareholders in London reaped enormous profits. Dalrymple underscores the callousness of this system, in which human suffering was subordinated to corporate gain. The chapter also reflects on the broader implications of the company's rise for India's culture and identity. Dalrymple captures the loss of intellectual, artistic, and architectural traditions that had flourished under the Mughals. The patronage of scholars, poets, and artisans dwindled as the company drained resources from the subcontinent. Delhi, once a vibrant center of culture and power, became a ghost of its former self, emblematic of the broader decline. The chapter's title, The Corpse of India, is a haunting metaphor for this devastation, a once thriving civilization left hollow by corporate greed. At the same time, Dalrymple does not shy away from the hypocrisies and contradictions of the company's legacy. He notes that even as British politicians and intellectuals debated the morality of the company's actions, they benefited from its contributions to the British economy. The company's operations funded infrastructure, wars, and the luxuries of an emerging industrialized society, even as they destroyed the livelihoods of millions in India. Dalrymple deftly links these historical events to broader themes of unchecked capitalism, exploitation, and imperialism, offering a scathing critique of the forces that enabled such destruction. By the end of the chapter, Dalrymple leaves no doubt that the East India Company's rule had left India shattered, its wealth transferred to Britain and its people impoverished. The subcontinent was no longer a thriving hub of trade, art, and culture, but a landscape of famine, decay, and subjugation. The Corpse of India is a stark and sobering conclusion to the book's central narrative, encapsulating the devastating cost of the East India Company's rise to power. Dalrymple's masterful storytelling makes it impossible to ignore the human and cultural toll of this corporate empire, leaving the reader with a profound sense of loss and injustice. In the conclusion of the Anarchy, William Dalrymple reflects on the broader implications of the East India Company's extraordinary rise and the devastating impact it had on India. He situates the company's story as not just a historical anomaly, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and the consequences of prioritizing profit over humanity. Dalrymple ties together the themes explored throughout the book, emphasizing how a private corporation headquartered in a modest London office managed to conquer and exploit an entire subcontinent, forever altering its history and culture. Dalrymple highlights the inherent contradictions in the company's legacy. On one hand, it claimed to bring order, stability, and even civilization to India, yet its methods were marked by corruption, violence, and an unrelenting focus on extraction. Far from civilizing, the company's rule left India impoverished and destabilized, with its once thriving economy in ruins. The wealth it extracted fueled Britain's industrial revolution and imperial ambitions, but at the cost of millions of Indian lives and livelihoods. The author draws a parallel between the company's behavior and the broader patterns of unregulated capitalism that continue to shape the modern world. He reflects on the East India Company as a pioneer of corporate imperialism, an entity that wielded the powers of a state while remaining accountable only to its shareholders. This dynamic, Dalrymple argues, set a precedent for the global economic inequalities that persist today, where the pursuit of profit often comes at the expense of justice and sustainability. Dalrymple also acknowledges the resilience of India's people and culture, which endured despite the catastrophic effects of the company's rule. While the East India Company's actions brought suffering and destruction, they could not extinguish India's spirit or its capacity for renewal. In this sense, the book ends on a note of hope, suggesting that while history often reveals the darkest aspects of human ambition, it also demonstrates the enduring strength of those who resist and rebuild in the face of oppression. The conclusion of the Anarchy leaves the reader with a profound sense of the moral questions raised by the company's history. It is a story of greed and ambition, of power wielded without accountability, and of the devastating consequences of prioritizing profit over humanity. Dalrymple's final reflections challenge us to confront the ongoing legacies of this era and to consider how the lessons of the past might inform a more just and equitable future. With its sweeping narrative and unflinching critique, The Anarchy serves as both a powerful history and a timely warning about the dangers of corporate overreach and the moral complexities of empire.